Hello and welcome to Hawkeye Nation. This is Hotcast, your Iowa football, basketball, and recruiting podcast brought to you by Go Iowa Awesome and Rivals.com. I'm your recruiting analyst and host, Eliot Clough, at Eliot Clough on Twitter, joined by Greg Smith from inside Nebraska this Tuesday morning, kind of out of schedule for us here on a Hotcast because of that early game, that Black Friday game this weekend. So, Greg, appreciate you hopping on. Secondarily, first thing we usually do when we have a guest on, especially if they have a new hire for a head coach, is talk about that head coach and how things have gone in their inaugural season. Matt Rhule, I thought it was an excellent hire, especially compared to the last few that they've tried to make. Thoughts on him and his first season?
Yeah, that it's interesting that you say that because I think that it was an excellent hire as well. I think that Matt Rhule was about as good of a hire as the athletic director Trev Alberts could have reasonably made, and so I think that it's gone about according to plan, or things are further along than you actually would have maybe thought in the off season. Like, I think that it's a weird season because it's been such a roller coaster where it felt like Nebraska was, it felt like they were in play for 7 or 8 wins. They actually were. They had 5 like a month ago, it feels like, and then have, been on this losing streak. And so that was in play for them. No one really expected that to be a thing. And for a couple of reasons. One, like, Nebraska has been bad like for the last several years, and Matt Rhule, his MO is kind of to be like even worse than what Nebraska had been his first year, right? And so for him to come in and have them like on the brink of bowl eligibility for a while now, it has been, I think, really impressive. It is even more impressive when you really dig into kind of the injury situation that Nebraska has faced this year. And I'm not sure, like, it's funny, I don't know if you got a chance, you probably didn't, to watch any of the Wisconsin-Nebraska game. They talked a lot about, the announcers did, about the injury situation at Wisconsin. Not all that much mention to the one in Nebraska, which has got to be one of the worst ones in the country. Like, Nebraska has lost several starting offensive linemen. I think 3 at the most at one time, was the most at one time they had out. One of them came back. They lost their top 2 running backs to injury. The third running back has fumble issues and barely plays now. So they're on their 4th running back. They've played 3 different quarterbacks. They have lost 3 wide receivers. Like, it's just kind of a wild situation. And as you notice, almost all of those things, all the things I just said, were on offense. Some of the things on defense have kind of shuffled in and out, but for the most part, they've been healthy over there, and they have much better depth. And so, yeah, the job that Matt Rhule and his coaching staff has done has been very impressive, especially when you start to factor in what's happening with the injuries on the offense, which is why the offense looks the way that it does, and the over-under is where it is for this game.
Oh, well, we'll definitely hit on the over-under for later on in the pod. And I also want to talk about the injuries, but to go a little bit deeper on Matt Rhule, what's been your gauge as far as like some key differences from last year to this year, and the way he and his staff have changed things in just 1 year? I mean, like you said, I was expecting 3, 4, maybe 5 wins at the end of the season, but not the start that they had, and fallen off a little bit recently, and all those injuries. But I was not expecting this kind of first season for Rhule in Nebraska.
Yeah, I think honestly, there's a couple of things that really stand out. One, and it sounds silly, but communication and kind of consistent messaging is something that these guys are really, really good at. And it ends up kind of trickling down to the players. If you go and listen to a Matt Rhule press conference, and then you listen to Marcus Satterfield or Tony White, the offensive and defensive coordinator, and then you listen to some players, they all say the same stuff. And I think one of the reasons that that's really important is that everybody's kind of pushing and pulling in the same direction, and there's true leadership to what they're actually doing, right? There's a rhyme and a reason, and you can kind of rally behind what they're doing. I think that that's really important for this particular program, because I don't think that they've always had that. I think that they've always kind of been everyone's kind of going their own direction, and you don't really have great leadership. So I think that leadership at the top, I think, has been one of the things that has really stood out to me. The other thing is that the emphasis on toughness and tackling, which we've then seen kind of show up on the defensive side, where they've been much better tackling overall, and that's really helped their defense, which is very good. The toughness has also kind of bled into just how they play. It's really interesting, and I'm talking to you about this because I have mentioned several times that I feel like they essentially want to be a version of what Iowa is, which is where you know what you're going to get from them, and they're totally comfortable playing in that, right? Like, it's one thing to say, oh, well, for right now, we've got to win kind of games this way, right? It's another thing to say, no, that's how we're just going to do it. Like, some of these games are going to be ugly. We're going to take it into the fourth quarter, but when we get there, our guys are going to be prepared and comfortable and ready to go because they're better conditioned, they're tougher, they know what it takes to go ahead and win those games. And that's the type of program that he wants to build, Matt Rhule. And having that kind of consistency and having that be something that is honestly really stated out loud, like the amount of times that we can everyone that covers the team can kind of regurgitate some of these lines to you about body blows and relentless, disciplined and violent, 75 rushing yards in the fourth quarter, like all of that stuff, because they say it all the time. And I think it's had a real impact on how they play and how they kind of build this program, which should be exciting to Nebraska fans for moving forward, because they're actually seems like there's a real plan in place for how they want to get this done.
Perfect that you mentioned Iowa. There was a snippet from presser yesterday where Matt Rhule praised both Kirk Ferentz and Brian Ferentz and said that he would have hired him or would have liked to hire him when he was at Carolina with the Panthers, Brian, in terms of like bringing him in to be an offensive line coach or a tight ends coach or something like that. Well, he might have the opportunity to
right.
at Nebraska. I guess it seemed super genuine to me. Do you think it was just coach speak, or do you think he actually feels that way about the Ferentzes?
Oh no, he feels that way. It's funny. There's a couple of coaching staffs that I feel like he in the Big Ten that he's kind of gone out of his way to make sure that everyone knows that he either knows or likes or wants to like kind of run their program like that. There's been three that have kind of stood out. One of them is kind of ironic now. The Iowa has come up a few times, and like you said yesterday, he mentioned that. Minnesota is another one that he's talked about with PJ Fleck and kind of how they do things in the kind of the offensive line play, the tough defense, that sort of thing, right? I think that's his row the boat stuff is all that's his own unique deal, right. But just the way that they play, and the way they take care of the line of scrimmage, I think is something. And then it's funny now that Michigan is another team that he's mentioned as far as just the physicality that they play with, in the way that they can still kind of bring some athletes in and still have some guys to be able to throw the ball, but still have that underlying thing of toughness. He hasn't mentioned them at all since that game, because we've all known what's happened since that game happened, and everything kind of blew up. Well, he's mentioned them, but not necessarily in a good way. But the Iowa thing, I definitely think is genuine, and I truly believe that if Matt Rhule could like snap his fingers and be like a team in the conference, it would be Iowa, because I think that the way that, and I watched the end of Iowa's last game, that game against Illinois, the way that they played, in that I never felt like in that fourth quarter that even though they were down at one point that they were going to lose that game. I felt that they'd find a way to make a play and pull it out in the end, and that's ultimately what Matt Rhule wants for this program. He wants them to, instead of it feeling like it does now, which is, oh no, they're down or one play happened, it's going to go the other way, and we've definitely seen that in the Iowa series as well. Like, instead of feeling that, it needs to get to that whole, okay, it happened, shake it off, we're going to find a way to make this work. I definitely think he has a deep admiration for what the Ferents are doing out there.
Now, you mentioned the injuries, a lot of them being on offense. I mean, is this just, I mean, because this same thing happened with Iowa. I tweeted about it after the Cooper DeJean injury. I think starting quarterback, 2 All-American caliber tight ends. There was another one in there, and that I'm just not thinking of off the top of my head. First round draft pick corner Cooper DeJean, who's also an incredible returner as well. I mean, you just can't really. Defensive tackle Noah Shannon, that whole situation going on. Obviously, all those guys gone. They're still 9-2 now, despite all those injuries. You know, when things like this have happened, I used to cover the New Orleans Pelicans. Fun fact, kind of been all over the place, but there were a couple of years where there were strings of injuries, and folks would start talking about the staff. You know, is it a staff issue, or what's going on here? Do you point to anything in this situation, or is it just like fluke bad year for injuries? Because that's just kind of been the general sentiment at Iowa for sure.
It's interesting. We have asked Rhule about that a little bit, and he has said that he thinks it's more of a fluke. But then he also adds the caveat, of course, that they'll look at everything in the offseason. My sense is that it's more of a fluke situation, and you'd have to kind of look at each one to kind of see how that goes. Because I know, and one thing that it's kind of low hanging fruit for people to point to is I should have said this on the things that have changed in the program is they hit a lot more in practice, right? Like this is now a team that definitely tackles in practice, and you can tell that because they're good tackling in the game, but also they come out of each week, it feels like, with some bumps and bruises, right? And so that's kind of the the yin and the yang, the byproduct of that situation. So some people have kind of blamed it on that, but people haven't gone full bore on that. I tend to believe that it's just more of a fluke situation, but we'll kind of see. I do think that they'll obviously look at it because Rhule is a guy too that has really kind of embraced like sports science and all of the stuff that kind of goes behind the scenes, and kind of keeping athletes recovery and all of that stuff. They have a new facility here that one of the big selling points on that is kind of all of the recovery tubs and all of that stuff. And so he's really in on that stuff and the trackers and all that. And so I would be shocked if he didn't look at everything that he could over the offseason, but I tend to go with it's more of a fluke.
And additionally, with all the moving parts, I know Jeff Sims was a big addition in the offseason, a guy who was seen to be dynamic. Like, what is going on? Is it just is the court like the offense as a whole? Obviously, all the injuries, obviously those factor in an immense way. Obviously, I'm not just talking about Jeff Sims here either, but like what is up with the Nebraska offense? Is it simply those injuries? Do you just point to that, or is it just getting things figured out? What's going on there? Because I could tell you all about Iowa's offense. I couldn't necessarily tell you about Nebraska's offense.
Yeah, there's three things the injuries have been a huge part of it. And the injuries have made it to where a team that came into the season that it's a rebuild, so they didn't have a ton of depth to begin with, right? And so when you start to have those injuries, you have to start playing guys that you had no intentions of playing, even if you like them long term. A perfect example of that is wide receiver, right? So they're now in a situation where they're playing true freshman wide receivers that they like in the future. Like Malachi Coleman was a top 100 recruit, was a four-star player. People really like him, and he's kind of come along and he's made some plays, but they weren't hoping to have him kind of like starting necessarily at the point that he was, right? The same way with kind of Jalen Lloyd is one of the other true freshmen playing a lot. The same Jaden Doss is going to end up redshirting. They had a trio of true freshmen that had been playing, and so when you start to talk about, at one point we looked out there and there were three true freshmen at wide receiver. I think Thomas Fedoni is a redshirt freshman or a redshirt sophomore but he hasn't played because of the injuries. At tight end, a redshirt freshman at running back, and a redshirt freshman at quarterback. And so you're like, okay. And then there were some young guys on the offensive line. And so you can tell that they're kind of just mixing and matching and doing whatever they can on offense to get personnel out there just because of those injuries. Now, if people from Nebraska are listening to this, they will say you have gone way too long without mentioning the turnovers. The turnovers have also been an enormous issue for Nebraska because you cannot. The one thing that I also mention to people when I talk about the Iowa comparison is that you cannot try and be Iowa when it comes to playing good defense and just ball control, flip the field, good special teams. You can't do that and lead the nation in turnovers. Like that doesn't compute. It doesn't work because your offense will never be good enough in that situation to then overcome all of that, right? And that's what they keep running into. I think their quarterbacks are now, coming in the last game, it was 22. So they threw one interception at the end. The quarterbacks alone are responsible for 23 turnovers on the season. It's very hard to win like that. So when you hear the injuries and you hear all those turnovers, you look up and you say, how in the world does this team even have 5 wins? Like they should not have the 5 that they have. And so that ends up being a thing. And then like the final thing really is, like I said before, the depth issue is the thing that you just don't have enough of it. And I know that people here are already there's a lukewarm-ish feeling about Marcus Satterfield, the offensive coordinator. I think he's fine. Like, there is no, like, I don't know how much you're supposed to do after all the things that I laid out to you. And you can't, it's really hard because there was a game, it's 2 games ago, I think it was the Maryland game, where they played 3 quarterbacks and all 3 of them had at least 1 turnover. Like, I don't know what you're supposed to do in that situation as a coach. Like, obviously, no coach is coaching you to go out there and just flat out drop the ball when you're running, right? Or drop a snap, or just chuck the ball up in the air in the double coverage, all of which happened in that game. So, like, I don't know, like Marcus Satterfield for me gets kind of he'll get an incomplete for this year. And then we need to see what happens as they reshape this offense or get these guys more experience moving forward.
And now we talked about those 5 wins in the first, more or less half of the season. And then they've lost 3 in a row. Mm-hmm. Lost by 3 to Michigan State. That one's just the brutal one of these 3, because Maryland's had some good moments this season. Yeah. They lost to Maryland 13-10. Obviously, Wisconsin has had a rough go of the season too, but they're still Wisconsin, and they won. Wisconsin won 24-17 in a situation where it was overtime. So obviously, it appears like Nebraska had them on the ropes at certain points in the game. Yeah. I guess, and I also saw on Inside Nebraska on your page, on your site, which you guys do great work over there. Check them out if you haven't. Thank you. That time management appeared to be an issue, or Coach Rhule referenced it, and there's an article about it on Inside Nebraska. And if you haven't seen it, again, go check it out. So, like, is there a commonality? Is it time management? Because that can be a factor in all of these games. I mean, when it's that close, like, is there any sort of, I don't know, synergy between these 3 losses, these recent losses?
Yeah, I do think that that clock management, time management has become an issue. And the thing to me the reason to me why it's happening is they're getting caught in between on whether or not to be aggressive or like kind of just run clock and just kind of let it go out. And if you think back to what I said about the turnovers, the new players, all of that stuff, I think that that's why they're getting caught in between, right? And so you had a situation in that Maryland game where they could have they were driving at the end of the game, had gone like 80 some yards, and could have kicked a field goal to tie the game. Maryland would have got the ball back. The defense probably would have stopped them. They would have went to overtime. Instead of kicking that field goal, on 3rd down, they went for a touchdown pass in the corner in the end zone and threw an interception. That was the right football play in a normal offense. You would call that play. They don't have a normal offense. They shouldn't have called the play. Like, you totally understand when they explain it and say, yeah, you run out of that scissors route and the guy is in the corner and either it's a touchdown and the guy comes open or you throw it out of bounds. That makes total football sense, right? You've heard that a million times. Like I said, not a normal offense, shouldn't have called the play. So you have that happened in the Maryland game. Then you get to the game against Wisconsin last week where Nebraska drove down the field, and this was in regulation, at the end of regulation. And it was like 1:20 left. They had timeouts. They let the clock, they ended up running like 2 plays. They let the clock run down. They weren't aggressive enough. They ended up getting the field goal, sending it to overtime, not doing anything with the ball in overtime and losing the game. And so people were then saying, okay, well, then in this case, you should have been aggressive, and then you weren't aggressive. You let the clock run down. And so that's where, yes, clock management is an issue, but I think it's not necessarily it's not James Franklin style where they're having issues managing the clock. I think it's an issue of being caught on whether or not to be aggressive or not, which is kind of understandable, but at the same time, you have to make a decision and kind of go with that. The other common theme, though, in these 3 games, and the defense has played well, but Nebraska is just not getting those kind of game-changing big plays from either side of the ball or special teams at this point in those losses, right? And some of those wins previously, they were getting really big plays. You were getting a block kick for a scoop and score. You were getting, a turnover that then put you deep in territory to set you up for a good play, or you were getting an explosive run play to be able to, get some points on the board. Like, those plays have kind of shrunk and become far and few between in this losing streak. And that's something that they'll definitely have to change if they want to get this win later this week.
Flip to the other side of things from the offense, which seems to be their Achilles heel, to say the least, regarding Nebraska. What's working so well defensively for the Cornhuskers?
Boy, they're well coached, well coached. Tony White, who I'm sure you've seen his name pop up for basically every job that has come open so far, except for Texas A&M. Tony White has been kind of mentioned in it, and it's got Nebraska fans kind of on pins and needles around here. And then Matt Rhule did not help matters by going out in this press conference yesterday and saying that, of course, Tony White would make a great head coach, and he's been called by a search firm, so people are kind of nervous about that. And so Tony White has been awesome, but the defensive staff as a whole has been very good. Terrence Knight, the defensive line coach, who didn't have a ton of experience but was well thought of. He's done a great job with that defensive line in particular as well. But then player wise, they do a really good job of running to the ball. What you guys will see in the game against Iowa is that you will always see multiple hats to the football, and that's something that they had not done in the past well, and they do a really nice job of that. They're just really sound, and the defense can trip other teams up because the 3-3-5 is so you can morph it into so many different things, and you don't know where pressure is coming from, and it's just difficult to prepare for. Plus the fact that Tony White is very good, that it makes for a really good combination.
All right. Iowa, of course, has seen the 3-3-5 earlier on in the season match up with Iowa State. Obviously, quite a bit of differences there, but personnel for Iowa being the top thing. Obviously, right. So many of those guys that are not available now. But to revert back to the game at hand, Nebraska going into this one, not only is it the Iowa rivalry, these two teams don't particularly like each other. There's always beef with the state of Nebraska and the state of Iowa. But the Cornhuskers are also fighting for a bowl game. And then you look at last year's game, what happened in Kinnick, Cooper DeJean goes down. I mean, is this team just like roaring and ready to go, just, on foaming at the mouth, ready to take on Iowa because of all these circumstances? Obviously, Iowa just won the Big Ten West as well. Like, where's this team at in their heads?
And that to me is the $1 million question for this week, because they all basically admitted after the game last week that everyone was really dejected and kind of broken after that game and losing that one to Wisconsin, and it hurt really bad. And so my question has been, it's only Tuesday, so we don't fully know yet, is how has the team really responded to that? Because it like you laid out, it's not hard to get up for your rival for a bowl opportunity and to, start your own little winning streak against them. Like, that would be nice, right? And so that should, by the time we get to the game, Nebraska should be in position to be where they're foaming at the mouth, ready to go out there for that game. But I do think that there was some licking of the wounds from the previous game to Wisconsin. And so that could end up being a factor. But I do think that it's funny to me that you mentioned that there's beef between the states and, the rivalry and all of that. And I agree that the fan bases have always kind of gone at each other. And I think that Iowa's players have always been rearing to go about this rivalry. And I'm not always sure that Nebraska met their intensity. And I don't think that flipped until it was actually 2 years ago. It wasn't last year with the win. I thought 2 years ago, Nebraska's players finally kind of were like, okay, we've got to go to another level because we're kind of getting tired of punched in the mouth here. Like it's getting out of hand, right? And then last year, they go out and win that game. And that was under weird circumstances, considering, we had the interim coach and, Matt Rhule getting hired and all of that. And so they pulled that one out in weird circumstances on the road. I do think that it would be for Nebraska a really big deal for a number of reasons to be able to win this game. But I feel like it's going to be in a similar game to the ones that both you and I have been watching with our respective teams for weeks now, where I think it's going to be close, and then we'll just kind of see what happens.
Over under, according to ESPN right now, this morning, 26.5. Oh, that's so gross.
That's ridiculous. Like, that's pretty bad. That's
the spread is Nebraska -2.5.
Which changed. It started out, I believe, Iowa -1. And so that's interesting that it's changed. no idea why that would be the case, other than maybe you give them home field. But it's interesting that over under, man. The problem is that even with that over under, like I would still go the under. Like it's not like I don't, because he's at 26.5. Like I see a 13-10, 10-7 type of situation, which is basically what both teams have been playing here for weeks. Because even you mentioned that 13-10 Maryland game, like even Maryland, who has a really good offense, like Nebraska did a really good job of holding them down. They just couldn't move the ball. Like, and the same thing happened against Wisconsin. And the same thing can happen in Michigan State. It's funny that Michigan State game, by the way, is held up as like this horrible day for Nebraska's defense for this year. They gave up 20 points on the road.
Right.
And so like it's just it's weird kind of where the expectations have shifted as it relates to the defense, and that tells you how well they have been playing. But yeah, that over under, we're in for a treat with some here.
That's that you might call it that. But the thing that has had me kind of changing my tune on some of these last 2 weeks, obviously 15-13 is not a barn burner by any means for that Iowa-Illinois game, but Deacon Hill is really starting to figure things out. I said it to Adam. I said it on Hawkcast here just a couple weeks ago after that 22-0 win over Rutgers. Is in that post-game presser, we saw a different Deacon Hill than we've seen the previous 6 weeks. And we had seen the previous 6 weeks. He has a command of the offense. Obviously he's still, he's not Cade McNamara. Like we're not gonna say that. Adam and had said that maybe we have a quarterback competition going into next year. I'm not so sure about that. But Deacon Hill has made some great strides, some enormous strides in the last few weeks. He's still Deacon Hill. He doesn't have great pocket awareness. Sometimes he's got a cannon of an arm, and sometimes he just overthrows guys. He's also listed at 260 pounds, probably is a little bit bigger than that. Okay. So the mobility isn't exactly there, though he did run for a first down on, I think, like 3rd and 7 last week, which was mind-blowing to everybody in the press box, that's for sure. But the offense has looked significantly better. 6 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, they would have lost that game against Illinois. I think you flip the Minnesota game to now, and Deacon Hill can get them in a position to kick that field goal, though they were riding off that, roller coaster of emotions within like 5 minutes of that Cooper DeJean, the return that wasn't. So part of me is like, Eliot, hit the over. You've seen how the Iowa offense has been. And then part of me is like, Eliot, and so I feel like I could see it going both ways. As in like Iowa scores 17 as opposed to 10, and there's a big difference there with how the offense operates. If it's 10-7, whatever, they only score 10 points. They just have to get into Nebraska territory, up to a decent portion of that territory by way of a turnover. Drew Stevens kicks a field goal, and then they get lucky with one score like they did against Northwestern when the offense was that bad. But 17 points, you got to have a level of consistency with the offense. So I'm going to have to go, man, I don't know. I want to hear your prediction first. Do you have a final score prediction at this point in the week?
Man, not yet. It's funny. I have to do another video later today, like late this afternoon, where I have to have one. And I don't have one for either. I think though, man, that 17 points though is kind of swirling around in my head. Is that like that's the number that you're gonna have to get to win this game? It's just whether or not it's weird because Nebraska has hit, and they did it last week. They hit 2 explosive plays for touchdowns against Wisconsin. And then they, for a long, long stretch of time, just kind of turtled up and didn't do anything. Like several 3-and-outs, did nothing. And so they've shown the ability to hit a couple of those. they're at home. Iowa, the defense is very good. Obviously, with the struggles on offense, the special teams won't be as good in as far as the return game without DeJean. I I think Nebraska right now, I would say 17-13 Nebraska and not feel great about it. It doesn't neither would surprise me. Neither team winning would surprise me, obviously. But the one thing that I'm fairly certain of is it's going to be one of those low scoring kind of ugly games where field position becomes really important. And the thing about that though is that something that's also really reared its ugly head for Nebraska, and this is definitely something to watch. Brian Buschini, the punter, has been on the struggle bus here recently. Like, it has not been good. And in a game in which points are at a premium and field position and flipping the field becomes so important, not being able to do that when it feels like every team in the conference has an all-world punter. Like, I swear to goodness, every week you look up and every team has a great punter. And so the other team always has that, and Nebraska has struggled with that. And so that could be a thing that ends up helping Iowa quite a bit in this game, especially if both offenses are sputtering along, and then you have a shank punt for Nebraska, and then all of a sudden that flips the field in the other way, right? It's because we've seen that. It happened last week against Wisconsin. And so that kind of has me nervous as well if they can't get that ironed out. But I'll stick with 17-13 Nebraska and kind of a classic Big Ten West showdown to kind of, I guess, to start the final weekend of Big Ten West play, right?
And I tell you what, I could see it going both ways too.
Yeah.
Especially because it's at Nebraska, especially because of the DeJean injury. Though Deshaun Lee is not TJ Hall from last year. Trey Palmer cooked TJ Hall the entirety of that game. That's not going to happen to Deshaun.
Yeah, they don't have Trey Palmer, so it's not. There's
exactly
there's
right.
No one in that realm.
Right.
So don't worry about that.
Okay. So I take note of that. I'm going to say 17-10 Iowa. So for now, Greg and I say hammer the over. Just kidding. Don't do that. No, this is one you stay away from.
Yeah, you just stay away from it totally. Though I think that I feel like I saw a stat, and I wish I had saved it, where like in these crazy Iowa over-unders where they've been so low, the majority of them hit the under still. So and I feel like it's the same way with Nebraska. Nebraska's been creeping that way too, with their over-unders, and they're not quite there, but this one will be an all-timer when it comes to that. It could be. It honestly, it would not shock either of us if this is 7-3. Like, it wouldn't shock me at all.
Right. And to boot, Iowa has hit the under 6 straight games.
Okay.
Fun fact for you. So yeah. Oh boy. We're in for a fun one this Saturday. So Greg and I are going to wrap it up here. Before I let Greg go, he and I are going to talk a little bit about recruiting, and that'll be something that we add to our premium board, assuming you have a little bit of time, Greg. Yeah. Not super long, but he and I are going to talk about recruiting, including highly coveted #1 quarterback in the state, Alex Mansky. That's going to go on our premium board. So if you're not a premium subscriber yet, you can check us out there, iowa.rivals.com/subscribe. Some great content on one of the top quarterbacks in the Midwest in Mansky, getting offers from all over the place now. He is a 3-star, and that very well could rise to a 4-star by the time it's all said and done. So we appreciate you tuning into this episode of Hotcast, brought to you by iowa.rivals.com. If you're not a premium subscriber yet, like I said, you can do that at iowa.rivals.com/subscribe. Subscribe wherever you're listening, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and especially on YouTube. Drop a like, drop a comment. Tell us, who do you think's going to win? What's the final score for this weekend, or this Friday, rather, this Black Friday matchup with Iowa and Nebraska? And again, on Apple Podcasts, leave that rate and review. Helps us out, makes us very happy. So for now, we'll see you next time.